Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar on ISO IDMP organized by Asphalion. First of all, thank you for my colleagues, Cristina and Lidia, for organizing and setting up this webinar. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Lourdes Martín, who will be presenting basically today the contents on the next steps in the transition to ISO IDMP. So, as an introduction, I introduce first myself. My name is Lidia Cánovas. I'm the General Manager of Regulatory Affairs here at Asphalion, and I'm also working in the Data Management Unit. And my colleague Lourdes, Lourdes, it is my pleasure to share with you this session today. Lourdes is Regulatory Information Manager at Asphalion. And Lourdes is biologist by training, and after a period in research and development, she started a career in the pharmaceutical industry in regulatory affairs and regulatory information management, and comes from a big pharma company. The objective of the webinar today is basically we will try to present in a practical manner how we see the next steps in the implementation of ISO and the IDMP, and basically in the transition of our well-known XVMPD system, and also how it relates to other implementations and investments that we can make internally as a RIM systems, or how does it how is it related to other telematic systems that EMA has under development. So these are the objectives of the webinar, and I would like, for those of you who don't know Asphalion yet, to introduce a bit who we are. So we are an international scientific and regulatory affairs consultancy with offices in Barcelona, Madrid, Munich, and London. Our team is now over 150 members, so we have to update it. And the company was founded in year 2000. Next, please, Lourdes, if you can, then our scientific and regulatory services cover from the start of development of a pharmaceutical product or a medical device or a advanced therapy until the moment when the product is already in the market. So from the beginning of life of the development, we provide regulatory support during all life cycle. And I think that this is the last introductory slide from our general organization, and then what our view and how we work in the data management unit in at Asphalion. So the RIMS RIM system, so to have our data organized is the basis of our work, and from that we can build upon in structured data systems to work in XVMPD, ISO IDMP for human medicines, but also there is the need for veterinary medicines because of the coming to force of the new veterinary regulation and UPV, and also for medical device. So in the units of data management, the RIM systems are, as you see, the basis of all these three parts of our work. Then,
yeah, so I take from here. Thank you, Lidia.
yeah, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Lourdes.
Thank you. So to give you an overview of our discussion today, we'll introduce to ISO IDMP and SPOR. We'll give you the background and the expectation on the implementation of PMS. We'll discuss the steps to transition into ISO IDMP, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. So to start with ISO IDMP, of course, we have to mention that there are 5 ISO norms that were developed to internationally harmonize the specifications for the identification of medicinal products, and this is where ISO IDMP stands for. And this is a set of data elements and structures that allow the identification uniquely for the identification and exchange of information. And they are standards that encompasses substances, units of measurements, pharmaceutical products, medicinal products, and controlled vocabularies, like, for example, dose form, units of presentation, packaging, and so on. So the way of the EMA to implement ISO IDMP is through a program that is called SPOR, and this stands from Substance, Product, Organization, and Referentials. They are all 4 different services, but that are connected, and OMS and RMS, which are the organization and referential, are serving as the base to the substance and the product services. They together is a business service that centrally manage data. It's a validated system that allows the view, the search, export, update, and reuse of information on medicinal products. So if we take a look about each service, then the substance allows to uniquely identify the ingredients and materials that constitute the medicinal product. The PMS is for the uniquely identification of medicinal products based on regulated information. The organization, or OMS, uniquely identifies the organization name and location address data for the organizations. And the referentials is the list of terms itself, or the controlled vocabularies that are used to describe the attributes for the products. What we know now is that we have in place the OMS and the RMS services. So you can go to the website and you can do already searches there. But for SMS and PMS, the work is still ongoing. So if we look a little bit into the timelines, then we see that in 2012, XEMPD was launched, and only in 2014 it became mandatory, 2 years after. And then new mandatory fields were added in 2016. So the RMS and OMS, which are the referentials and the organization service from SPOR, were launched in 2017. And then the start of the implementation for ISO IDMP in its first phase, which is the iteration 1, started somehow with the public release of the guideline in 2020. This guideline was later updated last year in June 2021, and was expected to be updated as well with some clarifications by this year, and we're still waiting for that. What happened early this year was that there was a mandate already to do corrections and updates to via OMS for manufacturers, importers, and distributors in order to get their certifications. And another important timeline is the go live of DADI, which is the new application form and is replacing the electronic application form, PDF based, that is currently in place now. And this go live will be in October 2022. What still remains unclear is when is SMS and PMS actually going live. So if we talk a little bit about the PMS implementation plan and what is expected, we know that the implementation plan was developed as a phased approach, and the iteration 1 is what we are expecting now. This only covers a subset of the authorized medicinal product part, and all subsequent steps or iterations will implement other product data elements and investigational medicinal products. So of our interest for iteration 1, we have the minimum data elements that are required to assign and maintain the identifiers for ISO IDMP. So the IDs for medicinal product, packaging, and pharmaceutical product. And those include as well the current information in XVMPD that are from Article 57. So if we look at the implementation guide, we have a structure with different chapters that describes not only the implementation process, but in detail what is needed and how it should be done. So in the introduction, we have the basis for the implementation plan. And in chapter 1, what are the requirements for the pre-registration? But when we enter in chapter 2, we already have the medicinal product information. This means the actual data fields that are required for the iteration 1. And along with that, we have chapter 8. We have all the examples to support that chapter. So you have samples set for each field that is required to understand how it should be completed. Chapter 3 has the process for the electronic submission. And chapter 4 and 5, the data quality assurance and the actual steps for the access of data and the export of data. In chapter 6, you have the specifications for the structure and format. This means for the fire message that has to be submitted to PMS. And this chapter 7 has the migration guide. So this will be all the steps and rules that EMA implemented or is to be implementing for the migration of the data fields from XVMPD into PMS. So if we look at the status, there were updates to be made to chapter 2, 3, and 8. And because we already know as well that DADI is coming live in October, we may expect some updates to chapter 7 as well, as EMA will have already done a migration and will have more data to update there. So as I say, the implementation plan was expected to be done no sooner than 12 months after the publication of the version 2.0, which happened already in 2021 on February. So if we look at the timeline, that leaves us 1 year after that publication. So we are now at the expectative to have more information on the implementation of iteration 1. We know that DADI goes live October 2022, and that for that go live, the migration from XVMPD to PMS has to happen. And what we can expect is that EMA will publish a separate implementation plan before the start date and a separate go live announcement for each of the steps of the implementation of iteration 1. So if we see this in a little bit more detail, we have again DADI on October 2022. But as DADI goes live at this timeline, we can only assume that it will already feed from PMS information, and that information is already migrated from the data that is in XVMPD. And since there is no information from the EMA on when the step 1 from the iteration 1 is starting, then our assumption is that the data in PMS will only be the data that was migrated at that point, so that it can go live and can be used. So the dates that you see there, not before February 2023, to be determined February 2024, which are the dates where the steps or the iteration actually becomes mandatory for centralized authorized procedure and for non-centralized authorized procedures, are still to be confirmed by the EMA. And even though there is no timelines yet. There is still a transition to do into ISO IDMP, which is complex, and we need to really start preparing for it because it's still a big challenge for everyone. So what can we do in the meantime?
Sorry to interrupt you, Lourdes, because yes. I see that I forgot to say something important. That yes. Anyone that has a question can write the question in the chat of the Zoom. So please feel free to write any question you have, and at the end of the presentation, we will try to respond.
Thank you, Lidia.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. So what can we do in the meantime? So we can start preparing for ISO IDMP. We can start thinking of a strategy for being compliant, and we have to think on the data. So what is the data that is required from PMS? What is the data that we have to search? What is the submission process, both internally within the company and the submission process for PMS? And what kind of technology is available? So we know now that XDMPD has over 50 data elements, and iteration 1 only covers around 150 data elements. But the idea will be that at the final implementation of IDMP, there will be over 400 data elements. So there is quite a lot of work to be done, and we have to start asking questions. So if we know what are those data fields that are required for PMS, who owns the data that you need to get, how will you get that data, and how will you enrich your data to be compliant for IDMP? We have to ask ourselves if we understand what is the process that modify that data, and how are you going to maintain compliance. And as well, of course, we have to think about RINT systems. If we have one, if we will get one, and if they will support ISO IDMP. So thinking about the strategy to make the transition for ISO IDMP compliance is at the moment data focus. So first, there is a gap analysis to be done that will help you understand the PMS data requirements, and to think and identify what of those fields are actually applicable to the portfolio. And then a step or a series of steps related to data management, that is understanding your own data, the quality, the sources, and define how to enrich the data, as well as identifying the process that are current and which are the improvements that need to be made around the submissions and as well as data governance to maintain data integrity, to maintain compliance, and also thinking, as I said before, about technology and digitization to maintain the compliance. So we need to really understand what choices are there and what is the best strategy for us. So talking about gap analysis now to understand the data requirements from PMS, we see that the guideline has 6 different categories. So medicinal product, marketing authorization information, ingredient, therapeutic indication, packaged medicinal product, pharmaceutical product, and all the data fields are arranged in all these different categories. So if we see in the graph in the middle, we have the conformance of all those data fields per each category, and we can see whether they are conditional, mandatory, or optional fields. And as well, we know that some of those fields will be migrated from XBMPD to PMS during the iteration 1, and it will be either a direct one-to-one migration or a rule-based migration. So to understand as well a little bit more what are the requirements of the data fields in PMS and what is the data that has to be searched from our side. So we took a look at the guideline and all the data fields, and then we identified those that are out of scope for you now. So those that there is no action for you, that can be either because the data fields are migrated directly to PMS, or because the data fields are created by default when PMS go live. And then we see that there is still a big part that requires your action. So those that come from other sources and those that are already in XEMPD but are not migrated. When I say other sources, these can be internal information, external information, structured, unstructured. But this is a big amount of work that need data fields that need your attention. And we have to determine what is applicable to us, how much of that data we already have, and we know where it is, how much we don't have, and we need to find where to get it, and how do we get to that data in the most efficient way. So when we talk about data sources, right, we have to think about it in an efficient manner that we find the most information in the less search. So of course, the data collection will depend on your organization structure, on the data sources, and on the data quality. But we can think first in a simple way whether the sources are structured, unstructured. So structured will be a regulatory system, a database, a tracking system, and unstructured will be documentation, so a section of the dossier, an SMPC, and so on. And as well, you can think of three main targets. So internal regulatory, like internal regulatory tracking databases or documentation, or internal others that can be different departments, that can be a quality system or logistics and production. And as well, the EMA databases that already contain information on the products like XDMPD, Eudramia, Eudamed, and so on. So to give you a few examples, these are the data fields for medicinal products, and I'll show you an overview of the data location. So if you see a little bit on a shade, are those data fields that require no action because they will be migrated or they will be default when PMS go live. And you can see that this is one example where a lot of the data fields are actually to be migrated, but still a portion needs to be searched. If you look in the middle in green, then you have that almost half of those are mandatory, which give it an importance. And then if you look at the sources for data collection, you actually see that it varies. That is mixed in between external databases and unstructured internal databases or sources. And most of it is unstructured, which adds complexity into getting the data you need. If we look at different example for packaging, for example, you see that there is not much that will be migrated, and there is a really big amount of data fields that you will need to find. And half of it is mandatory, which makes it critical. And if you see the sources, also most of it is from unstructured sources, which adds really big complexity to finding the data. So an example on packaging and the data granularity. We know that, for example, in XVMPD, the data on packaging was not mandatory. And if it was provided, then it was a direct copy of the SMPC into a field that was free text. And in contrast for PMS, there is a lot of detail and granularity and a mandatory for mandatory for the data fields. And then, for example, if the product have different components, let's say a solvent and a lyophilase, then you will have to provide the information for those components separately. For example, the shelf life for each, or even for manufacturing information is very similar. And it's add a lot of complexity and time and effort to get all the data fields that you will need to fill out. So we can see it in another way, but with the similar information. So for medicinal products, there is a table that I'm showing with the data field availability. You see that this was the example where a lot of the data fields were actually migrated, either by direct one-to-one migration or by a rule-based migration. I want to say each row is sort of a subcategory, so not necessarily it means that it's only one data field. So if you see the other sources column, there's still a lot of data fields that have to be compiled, and most of them are coming from unstructured sources, as I said before, which makes it, even though there are a lot migrated, it makes it still complex because there is a lot of work still to be done. If we see a different example for like ingredients, you see that very little will be migrated and a lot of data fields will have to be compiled. And as well, most of them will come from unstructured sources, which adds complexity and effort. So moving a little bit now to the strategy towards the data collection, we saw how the complexity can add up. So now that you understand the data fields that are needed and you know which ones are applicable to you and where do you find your data, what are your sources, then you have to design an efficient way to collect your data. And then you can base that on the complexity, on the conformance of the data field, whether it's critical or not. And you can do this, for example, if it's a straightforward field that is easy to find, and it's a conditional field and it's not critical, then you don't give it as much priority, whether you will give it a lot of priority to a critical mandatory field that is complex to find. So this all you can use to define a strategy. Now, once the strategy is in place and we have captured the data and so on, we also have to think of a way to maintain compliance. So you have to know your own process, you have to know EMA process, and you have to have a clear strategy defined. So what you should keep an eye on for your own process. So identify which are the current processes, for example, for publishing an ESCMPD, what is the data governance that you have in place, what trigger changes for each field, when and where is the data safe, if there is data duplication, who is responsible for using and modifying that data, if there are data owners that ensure integrity or not of that data. So all of this to think ahead to maintain compliance, data quality, data integrity. As well, to understand the process for EMA and SPOR. So what is the submission process? What are the requirements and the timelines? So of course, we need to understand when you can transition user-defined message and be IDMP compliant, when does it become mandatory, what are the specifications for the submission, and what are the processes. There will be processes different for a new product versus lifecycle maintenance versus submissions that are only for enrichment. And we need to understand how to manage those. And then the definition of the strategy. So how you will maintain compliance, what technology is available to you, how can you improve data governance, and what is your strategy for the PMS submission. And if you have a system or not, will you get one? And do you know if it aligns with ISO IDMP already or not? So with this line of thought, there is some models for implementing IDMP, whether you have an internal RIM system in place or not. So if you have an internal system in place, you can do the analysis of data compliance in the system. This will be the gap analysis. You can make updates to the system to a compliant version, and you can do enrichment of the data in the RIM system. Then the question is, if that RIM system is already fire capable, this means if you can already create a fire message and submit to PMS, or if you will need to prepare that fire message via an using interface. And the other model is when you don't have a RIM in place. If you are considering to implement one, then you can do the implementation in parallel to doing the gap analysis, analyzing the data compliance in your existing system and in the new RIM system, and do the enrichment, for example, in import tables, and then prepare to be PMS or IDMP compliant. And if you are not considering implementing a RIM, You can still do the analysis of the data in your existing internal database. You can update the system to a compliant version. You can do the enrichment in the existing system, and you can prepare to to create the fire message via the user integration portal. So in summary, so we discussed, right, you need to identify your data sources and find efficiency. So let's search more data. So you have to design a strategy that is smart for you. The collection of the data field for iteration 1. And after you have that collection, you have to check the data quality, you have to do data cleaning, and of course, then you have to do enrichment as well. And you have to develop a data governance plans to maintain that quality, that integrity, and that compliance. And you have to define your strategy. Whether or not you consider a RIM solution implementation, you have to decide whether you want to be compliant, do improvements, do a combination of those, and so on. So I stop here and I thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. Brilliant. Thank you for your presentation.